they lie and know that they're lying. These ladies finally, and it was a horrible thing there. The town, everybody pretended they didn't know anybody. So here comes Miss Lee Grant with her camera. This typical all-American town, red flags all over the place, everybody, American Legion, gung-ho, parades 3 or 4 times a year. Love, freedom, and democracy. So here comes Miss Grant and her cameras, like these gentlemen here. And they're going up and down this town trying to get the opinion of the man and the woman in the streets, right? And tell me if I'm lying, Gigi. They went into a supermarket. See, Americans lie to each other a lot. They went into the supermarket and they said to this lady, and this is one issue, can you tell me what is your opinion of the strike at the bank? And she said, is that camera on? Am I lying? And Ms. Grant says, yes, it's on. Got nothing to say to you. They went to about 20 people, all upstanding, freedom-loving Americans. And guess what? Guess what, Mark? They all did the same thing. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't talk to me. I have no... Now, let me ask you, class, why y'all think them people behave this way? Huh? Why you think they behave this way? Because they knew damn well that we do not live in any free society where everybody have a right to have their opinion. They knew that in most situations in this so-called free society, if you talk out of turn or you take the minority position, you're in big trouble, right? Them folks knew that this little all-American pretty town didn't have no problems because they didn't have none of those folks that they claim make the problems. No black folks, no crime. No Hispanics, no crime. But the interesting thing is when the chips are down, people behave like what they know the reality is. You see, when you I don't want to say nothing. Don't talk to me. What are you coming in this town? One lady gets up there, they're getting ready to cross the picket line, and these are neighbors, they know these women. They also know that if these women win, that it is going to improve conditions for everybody, other women in the town. And other women in the town took the position. I love being a housewife. I don't want to be out there. Well, that may be true. But the issue was not whether you love being a housewife. The issue was, and still remains for most people, are you entitled to a promotion if you do the job and you demand? That was the issue. But they turned it into, oh yes, the other thing was the outsiders who was doing this. And who are the outsiders? The outsiders always came from Moscow. This was before the fall of the evil empire. Now, of course, the demon is Saddam Hussein. I'm sure they got another one in the background waiting when they wear him out, or the public get tired of it. But what I'm saying is, in situations like this, certain truths come out about the nature of the society and by extension the world we live in. Now, if that had happened in Moscow or in Baghdad, everybody's brother and sister, right? Dan Rather them all even knew. See, there's no freedom there. People are afraid to speak their opinion because they know Big Brother is watching. Hell, Big Brother's watching all of us. And I guess Big Sister, Big Mama, and Big Daddy also. But the difference is the powers that be, the control that be, understand clearly whether you're talking about the control of a government, control of information, or control of history. And when you challenge that control, you got problems. When you talk about getting courses where people can argue ideas and have a mind and have opinions that differ from the so-called mainstream opinion, whatever the hell that is, then you have a problem. And if the program becomes successful, you got a bigger problem, as Ms. Rivera said. Yeah, but I don't understand. This is the only class. This is the only class. This class is the only class they've been able to get in the school where people come in here on a Saturday. And some have been doing it 4 or 5 years. The only successful Saturday class this Empire State College has ever had. Yes, full class. And you all know, some of you who's been a how we work to make it that way. It's the only class where students can stay here until we finish. If they can do it, go out, right? Now, wouldn't you think, forget about me, if you had such a class, wouldn't you think the institution would want to nurture this, right? This is a showpiece. right? You know they brought people here from France, from Europe, to come in and sit and observe this class, right? Am I right, Mr. Rucard? People went back, right?
That's the reason we gotta ice it.
Okay.
What's wrong with you, Professor Mackey?
Now notice that nobody in here has got one stealth bomber, huh? Nobody in here has got one rifle, not one fighter plane, no weapons at all. All we got coming here is with what? Our minds. And that obviously becomes a threat to the powers that be. Now, obviously, they've always wanted to, they didn't feel too good about courses such as this from the beginning, but now that there's a budget crisis, a crunch, they can, again, hide behind the fact there's a budget crunch to ice, these kind of concepts. So as you said earlier, how do you keep them going? You keep them going by having some kinds of input, and remember that you're never out of the woods. So again, as I just said earlier, when you look at this whole thing now that's happening in northern Iraq, where they say we're going to take that and make it a permanent home for the Kurds. Tuesday, a lady on ABC, and I didn't know it in my Wednesday class, some people saw it, she got up and took a picture, if you can believe this, about this size. They went into one of these Kurdish camps and they took a picture of this little blonde, ostensibly blue-eyed girl. I don't know if she was it was a black and white picture, but anyway. And so she was talking about giving a historical background on the Kurds. That's why I have to share this with y'all. You might find it amusing, but at least you know that there are other opinions than your professors. And this lady was showing this picture, and she was saying, you must understand that the Kurds are Europeans like us. And therefore the implication was that when we provide a homeland for them, we are providing a homeland for our own people. And I said, now isn't this interesting? The most famous Kurd in history is a gentleman whose name was Saladin, who we know as Saladin. And Saladin was the first of the Muslims who turned back the crusade in the Middle East, killed Richard the Lionhearted, and took over and, quote, saved Jerusalem and these places for Islam. Now we find that almost 1,000 years later, here's somebody on our news program who holds up a picture of a little blonde and says the Kurds are European. So what does this make Saladin then? So what that meant that what was he doing then? When he was out there icing Richard the Lionhearted and Leopold of Austria, then you would have to call him one of the first traitors, because he obviously was out there doing what? Killing his own people. Does that make sense to you? Of course not. Now, this lady, I don't know, remember the people, the personalities that we see on TV, they don't make the news. The editor hands them something and then tell them to read it. But they are the people that we see. They are the people. In other words, we don't see the camera person behind there. But unless there's a camera person, you don't get a video camera. So, obviously, we have to look at these people that we have learned to revere as these anchor men and women and realize that what they are doing, at best, is their mouthpieces. They're mechanical puppet that people hand them stuff and want to spew it out. And once we understand that, rather than getting involved at the Ted Koppels and all the rest of these things, they dare not ask questions that would open up cans of worms that would make people think. And they know which side their bread is buttered on. Right. And you must understand that Mr. Koppel earns, I don't know what the hell it is he earns, but he likes his lifestyle. Dan Rather likes his lifestyle. Sam Donaldson likes his lifestyle. These various people, they like their lifestyle. Now, they got nothing to do with their complexion.
$1 million to $1.5 million a year.
All right? And them little honorary Europeans like Miss Sue Simmons and them, they always smile. Oh, 150,000 Indians died in a typhoon yesterday. Ha, ha, ha. What the hell is funny about tragedy?
Yeah, I always think of that.
You know?
Smiling.
It's like, yeah, like somebody's told them when they went to a broadcasting school, no matter what you are describing, always keep that stiff. You're always smiling. And I noticed that only the black ones do that. I have to say that, y'all. I try to be as honest as I can. As though they're afraid that if they say, oh, prophet of gloom and doom, somebody comes and say, all of you niggas is fired. That's the truth. Yes. Mr. and Miss Personality. And that's what they're selling. So when you begin to look at where we're going in today, we have to take all of these things, these definitions, and look at them from the point of view of whose ox is being gored and who has an axe to grind. And this is all I've said, that in this class, we take the position, I take the position that even if they don't like what I say, it's only a minority opinion. And if the minority opinion can be that threatening, then this whole system is in deep trouble. Now, and as that has happened, and which now I can segue into this, if you understand what I've said before, then you can understand why there's so much confusion, outright lies, deliberate misinformation about this worldwide institution we call human slavery. And I would argue that it is probably, and there's no evidence for it except internal evidence, it is probably almost as old as the institution of prostitution. And it probably started when the first human being, male or female, recognized that for a hot moment he or she had the edge on some other human being that they mean and used them. Marriage, as we know it today, came out of slavery. And the vestiges of that slavery is still there. The ring, which is not a symbol of love. They used to put, oh yes, the bride, that's right, the bride used to get a chain on the leg. When the groom or the husband got it, he put the chain on the bride and dragged her off to his cave, and Mom and Papa, that's what, right? Later on, he said, hey, this chain is heavy, so you do a symbolic thing. For a long time, the ring only went on the finger of the bride. It is only in recently modern times that the condition of, okay, we will exchange rings. But that was not a part of that ceremony. He was talking really about a ceremony of belonging. When you look at some of the traditional African societies and others where they talk about what?
Bride price.
Bride price. What are we talking about? Huh?
Dowry.
No, it's more than that.
Purchase.
You're purchasing. Yeah, we call it when you get down to labor. Yeah, the dowry comes out of this. Bride price or dowry. Now, what are we talking about here? When we say bride price, suppose you cannot afford to pay the father a certain sum of money for his daughter, Bianca. Do we get it? No. Can you marry her?
No.
All right. All right, let's suppose on the other level, in European societies at least, suppose the bride can't come with some dowry to bring to the husband. Is the family going to approve of this?
No.
Huh?
No.
Right? Let's look at one of the old concepts. And again, we're talking the theme is slavery, oppression, but we're looking at various branches of it. Hopefully you can make the connection. Let us look in terms now of the law of rule of primogeniture. What does that rule mean? G-E-N-I-T-U-R-E. What does that rule mean? First born. And you notice it don't say prima. It says primo. A would be feminine, O is masculine. So when we say primogeniture, we are really talking about the rule or right of the first born son. What happens if you have 5 other sons, Gigi? What do they get? Let's say you're the lord of the manor. And Hopeton, he's the firstborn son. But there's Steve, and there's Hampton, and there's Michael, and there's Mark, and there's Clemson. What about the other 4 sons? What happens to them? What do they get? All right, so in Christianity, as you develop, you say what? The second son could more or less go to where? The church. Might go church. Third son becomes a what? A warrior. Or as he called him, a what? A knight. But these various options only came about much later. You see, in order for you to have a firstborn son as a bishop or whatnot, you got a system where that first happens. In other words, you're going into the medieval period of medieval Europe now, where the structure, in other words, you can't have a bishop unless you got a church. So the system before, quote, Christianity meant that the second son, or many times in the early days, or what they call primitive times, the second son would just be shoved out into the forest to root hog or die a poor pig. Now, we're talking possession and slavery. What about the females, Selman? For the daughters, nothing. So the only hope now let's suppose that the firstborn was a daughter. Nothing. The only way, if there was 8 boys and 1 girl, and she came first, the only way she could inherit anything, all of them 8 dudes had to die. And that is, they had to die without leaving any heirs untested. And even then, if she inherited from her father, if and when she got married, what happened to her inheritance? Who got control over it? Her husband. Hey, God, you know, I'm proud of y'all.
Okay.
Yes, Doreen.
I think in some societies there's still another thing going on.
Of course. Of course they do. Yes. But maybe with certain kind of modification for the thing. Now, when you go into Muslim countries, or any what they call the Orthodox Muslim day, or the fundamentalist Muslim, because remember, you got as many divisions in Muslim religion as you have in other Christian religions. So, but when you go into a place like Saudi Arabia, where even today, you know the problem what happened when Barbara Bush then went there, and she was supposed to say, you can't come here wearing that short dress. And we were supposed to be over there doing what? Desert Shield, protecting them from the great monster, right? But they didn't want our protection enough to say, So when they had the state dinner, what did the First Lady of the United States, the most powerful nation on the face of the globe, do? She was not there. She was not there because the women do not sit down with the men, not any purely Muslim women. You're still talking about a culture where, as I've indicated before, if you are convicted of stealing, off goes your hand. And there's still a lot of folks walking around in Saudi Arabia with no hands, and some with no feet. Now, I know it gets more difficult for you to steal something as more your limbs, your limbs get taken off. But nevertheless, at least there are people who have done this, and of course, if that don't work, you know what the next job is, right? Yes, yeah, they reduce your weight drastically. Now, I don't know what percentage of the body the human head represents, but whatever it is, it ain't there no more. And if you go into Ethiopia, if you went into Ethiopia under the rule of the late eminent Haile Selassie, you had the same thing, including the modern version of what is called slavery. Good evening.
Sorry.
Let me see, is your hands empty? Yeah. Check it out there, fella, because he might be the Duke, right? So, now.
Look at God.
Good night.
Well, I knew you have a legitimate reason. Give me my kiss. Come here. Bring your behind over here. Because you just in time to give me a little energy that I need.
Okay.
Thank you. Right. So, you find that sometime in view of my theme, we see how each one of these forms can merge imperceptibly into the other. First, you have a oppression, and that is to put something down. And oppression means you're going to slip and break your butt. So here we are. I think we now begin to understand why I put this up here. Oppression, suppression, slavery, servitude. But all of these are a part of this. Because one of the terms that they used to refer to in the early days of England, they referred to the wife as a slavey. My slavey. And of course, when you talk about these, there are in all of these a relationship. The relationship between the oppressor and the victim, between the master and the slave. And we see, I hope you see, that all of these things fall out of each other. Slavery, servitude. When you talk about servant, servitude, servile, all comes from the Latin word for slave. The Greek word, of course, is take my word for it. I just throw that up there to let y'all know that, when I want to do it, I can. All right. And then if they add this to it, which is a pi, that equals
runaway slave.
Now, the Greek goes way back. What does this tell us? Don't this tell us something very important about slavery and about human beings? Meaning what? If we add this, and now this is a slave who runs away, or as they said, a slave who's hidden, same thing, how they described it. That meant that early on from the beginning, that the slave did not, or the servant or servant did not really approve alike of a system. But if we look at the testimony from the master or the master class, here's what we find. And I'm going to read this from Dr. David Bryan Davis's book, Slavery and Human Progress. And that's why I put the Greek phrase up there. Let us go back and look at a quote that he has from Aristotle. Again, from the rationale of the master or slave-owning class. Now listen to this. Quote, and see if you can think of any modern parallels. Quote, for all tame animals, there is an advantage in being under human control, as this secures their survival. And as regards the relationship between male and female, what I just put up here, the former is naturally superior, the latter is naturally inferior. The former rules and the latter is subject. Now this is Aristotle talking about what? Male-female relationship. Now watch this cuteness, and you see the technique is not new. It wasn't invented. Watch the cuteness here. By analogy, the same must necessarily apply to mankind as a whole. Now, ain't that cute? Here you go from a specific, which you set up the cards, right, to suit your condition, and then you go from that and say, what? Well, this is true, yes, the general. That's the way it is for man. Now, remember, Aristotle is considered today. You don't study the classics of philosophy, right, without studying Aristotle. It's just like if you're a good Catholic scholar, you study St. Thomas Aquinas. This is the great Aristotle.
Disgusting.
Huh?
Disgusting.
Well, hey, it gets more disgustinger. Yes, Brother Kupo.
I said it's normal. I mean, this
Okay, right. Now, I'll take my hat off to this.
that's cute.
Yes, right. Now, so I can see. By analogy, the same rule must necessarily apply to mankind as a whole. Therefore, all men who differ from one another by as much as the soul differs from the body, or man from a wild beast, and that is the state of those who work by using their bodies, and for whom that is the best they can do. These people are slaves by nature. And it is better for them to be subject to this kind of control, as it is better for the other creatures I have mentioned. For a man who is able to belong to another person is by nature a slave, for that is why he belongs to somebody else. And how about that logic, huh? Assistance regarding the necessities of life is provided by both groups, by slaves and by domestic animals, meaning that human beings, you tame domestic animals to do certain service to you, and you also own slaves to do certain service. So both, as Aristotle sees, are necessary. The slave and domestic animal both provide certain necessary services, of course, to the master in society. Nature must therefore have intended to make the bodies of free men and of slaves different also. I ain't making this up. Slaves' bodies strong for the services they have to do. Those of free men upright and not much use for that kind of work, but instead they are useful for community life. And this is from Aristotle's Politics, chapter 1, paragraph 5. And then we have another quote here at the bottom, and I like the way that the author has juxtaposed this. Quote, owners often have to be reminded that this is actually a golden age for the family dog. Far and away the best that he has ever known, and especially for the old dog. There was a time, more recently than you think, when by present standards all dogs were miserably treated. Old dogs live well today. They are cherished and preserved and protected. They are comfortably housed and too generously fed. They are healthier and stronger, and they live longer and more happily than they ever had in the past. Far from being outcasts, they have become the most privileged characters in every household. And this is a quote from an outstanding doctor of veterinary medicine, George M. Whitney, in an article called, a book called The Health and Happiness of Your Dog. So now you compare these two articles and you see what they're telling us, right? All right? Now, then we move over here for a minute and let us go back to look at the scheme of slavery servitude. Let's look at, I'm using these books because they are out of print. They can't come by and I have no more copies, so I have to quote from them. This is a book called The Militant Dissenters by Stanton A. Coblentz, C-O-B-L-E-N-T-Z. And it was published by Barnes and Noble and Thomas Yosseleff. And here's what he says. Let me get the date it was published. Yeah, it was published in 1970, so that's 21 years ago. And here's what it says, a little background about the book. The Militant Dissenters by Stanton A. Coblentz. Militant dissent has not been confined to our own times. It has been one of the key phenomena of the ages. So much so that we cannot understand today's disturbances without reference to those of yesterday. This is made plain by Stanton A. Coblentz in the first wide-reaching survey of the subject. In this book, he has chosen representative cases varied enough and characteristic enough to eliminate the trouble present by reflections from the uprisings and rebellions of the past. He shows that, despite the powerful glare of current publicizing media, that word again, the contemporary activists are not a new breed sprung full arm from the brain of a modern Jove. In the militant dissenters, we see that riots, insurrections, and revolutions have been prominent in the history of most lands, second only to warfare, and in some cases not even second to that. We follow the slave flare-ups in ancient Rome, the fire disorders in the ancient Near East, and what are we talking about? We're right back to Iraq, etc., Kuwait again, right? Revolts in England, the Netherlands, France, and North America, the Black Revolution in Haiti, the uprisings in Mexico and South America, the cracklings throughout Europe in 1848, the crucial outbreaks in Russia, Germany, Italy, and China, and the tumult in present-day United States. Here, in a comprehensive review, we see the reflections of our disturbed past upon the anti-war demonstrators who march in moratorium parades and tried to halt troop trains and shipments of napalm, the dissident students who occupied administration buildings and small and smashed campus windows and college facilities, the black insurgents who set fire to stores and houses, the near-guerrilla warfare that interrupts the national political convention. Thus we become aware that such eruptions, not being confined to the United States and being by no means without precedent in the disturbed records of our own country, represents history in the process of repeating itself. Because history does repeat itself, Mr. Coblenz's evocation of the rich experience of the past not only offers a new, well-rounded, and objective approach to present upheavals, but will serve to clear away much of our bewilderment and bring life to these tormented times. And I will just read you one passage from him called Bursting the Boilers of Ancient Rome. And in part 2 of this, he says, let's go for part 1. So sort of put this in perspective. Am I boring anybody?
No.
All right. Bursting the boilers of ancient Rome. The year was 137 BC. All right? That's before the birth of Christ, which means over approximately 2,000 years ago. The man was a 26-year-old Roman of gentle bearing and refined manners on his way to Spain to assume his duties as questor or governor. The region was Eritrea, whose fertile fields the young man was viewing with shocked eyes. Everywhere the small farmers had forsaken their holdings, leaving the ruins of their houses to weeds and the wild beasts. Everywhere the land-owning capitalists dominated. The slave drivers swung their lashes over cringing barbarian backs. And they were not talking about barbarians that looked like most of the people in this room. Remember the definitions? What was the ancient definition that the Romans and Greek had? Who was civilized?
Us.
And who were the barbarians? Anybody who was not a Roman or anybody who was not a Greek. What did it have to do with wogs? The universal wogs. Thank you. I like that. The wogs. Did it have anything to do with color?
No.
It had anything to do with hair texture?
No.
Eye color?
No.
Because the barbarians meant anybody outside. Now, ruminating on the depopulation of the land, the observer reached a conclusion which he would express in an eloquent speech, quote, "The beasts of the fields and the birds of the air had their dens or nests, but the free man of Italy had not a roof to shield his head." Now, this is in the days of what we call about the Roman Empire. Sound familiar? Let me talk about this again. Had not a roof to shield his head? Anybody need to go look in the Port Authority building? And Rome was as rich and as powerful in its time as the United States of America is in ours. What then had that wealth and power done for the average Roman man, Pat? What it done? Nothing for him, one moment. And the revolution, all right, in this thought, there lay the seeds of revolution. And the revolution was to be begun by the young man Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus. Unlike many reformers, he was an offshoot of the privileged classes, a grandson of the renowned Scipius, who? See how it all ties in? His granddaddy was, they used to say Scipio
Africanus.
Now, ain't that interesting? So where that means his grandfather got his reputation? In Africa. The Romans had a custom that whenever a general went someplace and won a victory over a city or a territory, they gave him a new name. So Scipio Africanus, when they attached that cognomen on it, meant that he had won a great victory in Africa. But now remember that Africa to the Romans was only that part which is now on the northern tier of the Mediterranean. And that is why the Arabs and those folks look like what they look like. And that is why, as my colleague, Professor John Henry Clark says, that anybody, as my esteemed colleague, Professor John Henry Clark says, that anybody that you see that is of light skin in Africa are either they are invaders or descended from invaders. And if you go and study again that whole Mediterranean area, which imperceptibly, historically, as you do, blends into what they call the Near East, it becomes very clear of why these people in this area look like what they do, for the same reason that why the people in this room look like what they do. And I'm only talking about those folks who theoretically is from the African persuasion, because ain't no two of us in this room got the same complexion. And the same thing that's happening to us constantly was also what happened in the whole Mediterranean area, which is why the Greeks, the Italians, the Spaniards, and all them folks are dark. And that is exactly why the Americans refer to the Arabs contemptuously as what? Sand niggers. In case y'all don't know how it's there.
Camel humble buffalo.
Yes. Because when you're looking at a degree or shade of darkness. But when we watch this, now remember, when you looked at ancient Rome, you were not looking at, quote, a Simon Pugh race. The Romans, again, look pretty much like the modern day people of the United States. And for, guess what? Surprise, surprise, the same reason. The term black Irishman, Pat, is no accident. The term dark Englishman turned inside out is no accident, Michael. There's a thing historically, but we must understand when we look at these areas, we must try to not look at these people through our eyes, to make the attempt to see them as near as we can through the eyes of their contemporaries. In other words, to try to see the ancient Roman or Greek or Celtic society in terms of modern attitudes of racism and ethnocentrism would mean to blind ourselves to the culture, because we would constantly not understand why people did what they did. Race had no bearing in Roman society. Class did. Status did. Previous condition of servitude had no permanent stigma in Roman society. Because of ancient Rome, we know that there were slaves who rose to become emperors. The color was in Septimius Severus. And we have also examples of emperors who descended and became what? Slaves. The fortunes of war, which really in the beginning was what started it out. After the difference, the first kind of slavery, as I said, would have to be domestic. Man enslaving his woman, and then his animals. And then, by extensions, you're fighting over something, and if you lose, you end up being put in some kind of servitude or being killed. So what we find from this gentleman coming here, as Mr. Cobbins tells us, Gracchus was an offshoot of the privileged classes, grandson of the renowned Scipio Africanus, who had overcome Hannibal at the Battle of Zama. His father, also named Tiberius Sempronius, had held high offices, including those of censor, consul, general, and governor of the Spanish province of Ebro. What are we talking about? Roman province in Spain? Now remember, this is when? 137 years before the birth of Christ. His mother, Cornelia, Scipio's daughter, was one of Rome's most distinguished women, a person of high intelligence and noble character. The young Tiberius had been reared with every advantage of his age. He had been trained in the Greek language by his tutor, a learned Greek what? Slave. Under his brother-in-law, the younger Scipio Africanus, he had fought with distinction at Carthage, or Cartagena. Now, where was Carthage? Carthage is now where ancient Tunis, Tunisia, and Morocco is. That ain't in Europe. That's in Africa. So how they can talk about calling Africa the dark continent? He had fought with distinction, and in Spain, his diplomacy had saved a Roman army of 20,000 men. Had you been one of his circle, you would have laughed to scorn the idea that such a man could become a revolutionary. But history is full of such examples, aren't they? What personal complaint had he? He need only repeat the conservative patterns of his father, and honors, high offices, and wealth would lie before him. As it happened, however, he was not content to repeat the pattern of his fathers. He knew that the times called for a change, and in his eagerness to hasten and direct events, he had no regard for the saved traditional course. And that is how we define a revolutionary. Someone who is by nature not willing to wait for the tides of change or the winds of change. This was not only because he was driven by youth's usual impatience. As we look back, we can see that the Roman state tottered in a dream world of false security. That sound familiar? As we look back, we can see that the Roman state tottered in a dream world of false security, paying the heavy, unforeseen price of a long series of successful wars with Carthage and in Macedonia, which is, of course, part of present-day Greece. Asia Minor, which is another name that they now call the Middle East, and Spain. The victors had cursed the victor, or the winner. Does that sound familiar, y'all?
Just like today.
The inflow of spoils, slaves, and luxuries had subverted the ancient social order, torn down the old economic adjustments, and brought debilitation and demoralization. Politically, the state was stagnating and decaying. A group of patrician families had parceled out the coveted positions of governor and censor among themselves. It's eerie how contemporary this sounds, isn't it? Giving Rome a do-nothing government of nonentities. Not that no effort at reform had been made, but little had been accomplished by the measure that gave Roman citizens the ballot in popular assemblies and permitted them to vote for the popular tribunals. The masses had been inflated with an ostentatious self-importance, and power had been put into the mouth of the shouting riffraff of the streets. You had a comment? What's that sound like, sir? Brother Hopeton? Gordon? What does it sound like? Y'all recognize any of these things? At the same time, the problems of the state were mounting. And this, of course, is why I'm reading this section to you. Rome's Italian allies, scorned and disgruntled, were demanding broader rights. Central America. and this was leading toward the revolt of the important city of Fragella in 125 BC, and the bloody social war of 91 to 89 BC. Meanwhile, the plight of the small farmer continued to deteriorate. More and more countrymen flocked to the cities. More and more shackled and branded slaves replaced them. And slave revolts threatened increasingly. Yet how to restrict the slave system and put the Roman farmer back on the land? Tiberius Gracchus thought he knew the answer. It lay in the vast public domain which Rome had acquired in her wars. Large land holdings might be split and made available in inalienable parcels to Roman citizens, while a regulatory commission administered the law. With this end in view, Gracchus moved, let me spell the guy's name so if you see it again you'll recognize it. Okay.
Did he have a brother?
Yes, he did. With this end in view, Gracchus moved into immediate action after taking office as tribune, which would be like governor, sister, whatnot, of the people in 134 BC. Unfortunately, there were disadvantages to his plan. Some possessors, whom we would call squatters, were excluded from territory which they cherished as their own, and on which they had perhaps spent much money and labor. Also, the members of the Senate who belonged to the landlord class were by nature against the idea. They come at these lazy bums on welfare. It was their opposition that brought the 29-year-old statesman to a decision that harbored the germ of violent dissent. He would bypass the Senate. Like a modern lawyer, however, he looked for a precedent, and he found it in the example of Flaminius, who a century before had pushed a land bill in defiance of the Senate, but resistance came from an unexpected direction. Marcus Octavius, a fellow tribune whom Gracchus had considered his friend, interposed his veto. On legal grounds, this should have ended the case. A tribune's veto was absolute, but Tiberius, going beyond legal means, exchanged constitutionality for revolution. Probably he and his followers did not put matters to themselves in quite this way, yet how else can we interpret his actions? Having suspended the business of the state, having closed the courts and the treasury, having offered his law for a second time, having encountered a second veto from Octavius, and having entered into futile discussion with the Senate, he was at an impasse. Seeing no recourse now except in an appeal to the rabble, he went before the assembly with the statement, quite unauthorized by law, that either he or Octavius must surrender his tribuneship and that the people must decide between them. In this he took no chances. There was no question what verdict the mob, composed of every floating element, farmers, slaves, aliens, and citizens, in a riotous mixture, would shout to the man who had catered to its wishes. The next week, Gracchus' proposal, of course, passed by a large majority, and now he took the violence-torn road of no return. At his bidding, Octavius was put down from the bench by the lectors. Then, while the mob cheered, the farm law was passed, and the first commissioners were nominated: Tiberius, his father-in-law Claudius Appius, and his 20-year-old brother Gaius. Thus he aroused questions that remain to this day. While a strong case can be made for the reforms he introduced, the result was tainted by his methods, which had in them something of the presumptuousness of the usurper, something of demagoguery and rabble-rousing, and led to results disastrous for Gracchus and costly in many ways to Rome. The element of force had been injected into his dissent, as had the substitution of force for law, and force would flourish and spread to his opponent and would be expanded frightfully in the culminating episode of his own life. So, of course, as a result of this, you had the uprising of 137, which changed the nature again, all because the people who had the power refused to relinquish anything, even though they weren't even using the land. Then he tells us here in another section, Part 2, Slaves versus Masters. We moderns, bedeviled with problems of black and white, whose origins we can trace to the African slave traffic of 4 centuries and more, may not always remember that slavery in other land and eras had likewise resulted in long-range unrest and revolt. In ancient Rome, for example, the challenges were severe and perennial. Like all other ancient countries, and like the pre-war American South, Rome built her economy on slave labor. Now, I will repeat that so you understand. Like all other ancient countries, and like the pre-war American South, Rome built her economy on slave labor. But this, in turn, was based on war. And it is therefore not surprising that the situation became acute after the series of large-scale wars that began with the 3 Carthaginian conflicts, or the Punic Wars as we would know them. These contests, including the fighting in Spain, the, quote, Near East, and elsewhere, brought Rome not only rich treasure in metal, gems, and fine cloths, but booty in one of its grimmest and most dangerous forms, quote, that of 2-legged captives who would become abundant enough to be a cheap and disposable commodity. Their discard when they became too old and worn to be profitable was advised by that practical old realist Cato the Elder, who said that once a slave could no longer be useful, the thing to do was not to let him or her live to be a burden on his master. That once a slave could no longer at least make earn enough to support his own keep, then they should be killed. How the slaves themselves felt can only be judged by their actions. Huh? Since they were not able to record their side of the case. Sound familiar? It has, however, been well said that the slaves caused Rome to dwell for centuries on the lid of a slumbering volcano. The slave system, the reliance on the large ranches which specialize in the grape and the olive while neglecting the traditional cultivation of grain, was at the root of that decay of Italian agriculture whose beginnings had been noted by Tiberius Gracchus. A decay which sent the impoverished farmers flocking to lead disgruntled, if not parasitic, lives in the cities. Now let me say here parenthetically, how did this city become, in northern cities, become overcrowded with black folks? Thrown off the land in the south, is that not correct? Running to the cities hoping for succor. Why did the Irish come here, sir, in the 1800s, in the 1840s? To try to do what? They couldn't, the English took away the land, right? You can't grow nothing to eat but the potato goes rotten, and you got 2 choices. If you can, leave or die. Man's inhumanity to man. Same face, same mask, all the time. Now, to get back on target. Pictures have come down to us of branded slaves laboring by day with shackles on their legs and sleeping at night in dank dungeons or ergastula. And this is evidence for the view of the historian Mommsen that the sum of all the black suffering in America, as great as it was but a drop compared with the afflictions of the ancient Roman slaves.
Can you give us some idea of what that slavery was like?
Oh yes, I will go into my next period. But this is part 1. We can't cover everything in the first part. We have to get back down. That's what you asked for, sir.
Because the African slave institution is so horrible.
Oh yes. I'm not. Wait a minute. Remember. Hold it. Wait 1 minute. Now what did I say? I didn't say this is not a flat statement. Do you follow what I'm saying? This is a statement by Mommsen the Christ, right? Let me read this to you again. Mommsen cited the conditions as saying, but that Mommsen was not a slave, Roman or African. All right, so I quote this as an opinion, not fact.
From their own
All right? The fact we'll have to, in order for us to prove the fact one way or the other, we have to compare A, B against the other. Now, my own argument would be, based on what I've studied in my theory, is that all slavery, quote unquote, is bad. You see, to argue which slavery was worse, are you following me, Minister Brown, is to put the cart before the horse. Because what that leads us to, in my view, it leads us to the specious argument of the good master versus the bad master. You all right? Thank you. You see what I'm saying? So we don't make a case for. We can cite the examples, and we should. And I don't even argue that. But my position is that slavery of itself is an evil. Now, within that system, there may be one slave or a group of slaves who might not gotten beaten this morning, but that is not the case. I agree what Aristotle said. Remember the first thing I read here in this, starting this off with, Aristotle made the statement about if you are a slave, you are by nature
inferior.
Thank you. So I see it's stuck. All right? Now, we must also remember, I didn't state it at the time, I didn't think it was necessary. We must remember, let me put it to the class. Which class do you think Aristotle belonged to? The master-owning class or the slave-owning class?
Master-owning class.
Obviously the master-owning class. Once again, the slaves who were contemporary, the Greek slaves contemporary with Aristotle, nobody asked their opinion, did they? We have no record of what they thought of the system. Right? We only have, to a certain extent, you ready? Let me just finish. We only have, to a certain extent, a very small part of what the slave system was during the South and the West Indies during the African slave period. Because when you look at all of the writings on American or Caribbean slavery, the amount done by slave, like the slave narratives, the autobiography of Frederick Douglass and others, amount to a very small part. And this is when I told you beginning. Slavery is usually an exercise that is participated in by winners. Slavery is an exercise that is usually or has largely been participated, or slavery is an exercise that has been largely written by winners. I mean history, of course, is an exercise largely written by winners. That means then that by the very nature of slavery, no slave at any time and place would have access to the abilities to get there, to the means by which one gets one's view out there. Slaves were not lawyers in any system. They were not permitted to be lawyers. If you're going to be a lawyer, there's a contradiction between being a slave and having privileges. Because a slave by definition cannot have anything that the master does not wish to concede. And I've said this before and I'll repeat it again to make it absolutely clear. Look at that argument about the good master and remember, the argument about the good master, as Monson's argument, is a question of trying to divert the argument to an either or. I'm sure that if we could go back in time and approach one of those Roman slaves and ask him or her, what kind of slavery do you think is the worst? I think we know what the answer would be, don't we? The slavery that I'm in. Because that's the slavery I know. Let me say, right? You follow what I'm saying? And if you went and you asked the average slave in the West Indies or in the South of South America, what slavery you think is worse? The slavery that I know. And the concept of the kind master was always something that was an idea of the master's thing, because the master always wanted to be thought well at any period in time. Are you following me, Dr. Brown? He always wanted to be thought well of. Even the cruelest of masters insisted that I am doing this, I am whipping the slave for his or her own good. And we know this. Remember I told you earlier about why, I mentioned to you without stating, because we wasn't on camera then, about about Annie's book, and I told about Charles Dickens, David Copperfield, and how when he came here, they literally chased him out the country and took away his royalties of his book. And why they did this? Because Dickens went and took a hard look at the American slave system. He copied in a book called The American Notes, which I'll bring in next week. You might be able to find it around. If you can, I would suggest you do it, because he looked at American society as it looked in the 1840s. And he copied down advertisements from the daily press at the time, the daily newspapers, of masters advertising for runaway slaves. I have read some of those things in this room, and some of you at other occasions, where the masters, and that tells you the reality, never mind what the apologist says, where masters said, "Run away, my mulatto wench, Kitty." And now you got a physical description of Kitty. And the description would go, "She has 3 front teeth knocked out, where I knocked them out. She has a mark on her shoulder where I dug in." This Dickens repented this. "Her back is much scarred by the whip." Now this is no lies here. Are these lies, Patrick? No.
The master wrote himself.
Yes. Not only why, and why did he do it? He was doing it because he wanted his... All right. And he, allow me, Sancho, I'll tell you when I'm ready. Let's try to hold it. I realize you got this great enthusiasm that I bring out of you. But if you cut me in, my mind is not what it used to be. Allow me to wet my whistle. Now, we know what this man Tom looked like, and it's interesting that he didn't give him a last name any more than he would say, "My Negro man Gordon," or "My man," or "My slave Doreen," or "My slave," "My wench Bernice," or "My wench Blanca," or "My boy Patrick." Name, no last name. Obviously, it was not important to have last name, was it? I mean, since you didn't know, you might wake up with one last name in the morning, and by nightfall, you might have 2 other names. So he described Tom as being tall, lanky, and red hair, and the way he put it in the archaic 18th century terminology, his face much besmirched with freckles. Tom was a carpenter, but he was a master carpenter, and his loss has been of his absconding has been of considerable loss to me. About 6 foot something, lean boned, and anyone who gives me information leading to the recapture of my man Tom will have as a reward, if he gives information that leads to the capture, he will have the reward of 25 pounds. If he captures Tom and returns him to me at Albemarle, County, Virginia, he shall have 50 pounds plus expenses. Now, Arthur Schlesinger, whose European credentials are impeccable, that is the son of Arthur, the father of Arthur Jr., who was a historian at Harvard. In his history of the American history, he quotes this. This was from an advertisement that George Washington put for his property, his runaway property. So when we look at the story, remember always that by and large we have the story through the eyes, if not of the master, of people who belong to the same ethnic group or the same class as the master. But given that what we have to take these records and use them until we can do better. Because everybody has the tendency of trying to smooth over their own faults while working up in terms of the others. So when we look at this thing about which slavery was better or worse, my answer to that would be slavery. Because, as I said to you earlier, suppose you have one of these quote good masters, right, Blanca? And he treats you good for 20 years, lets you sleep in the house, say, "I like you. You know, you can be my wife's companion. You go everywhere with the missus. You don't have to do nothing. You eat at the master's table," right? and you go out. You can even have the privilege of kicking the other house slaves behind. Right? Because you is the master's ace boom. And then, New Year's Day of the 21st year, he calls you in and he says, all right, Blanca, get your butt out of here and go back down in the quarters with the rest of the slaves. And what'd you say? Repeat that where everybody can hear you.
I said she's devastated.
Why is she devastated?
Because she had been living a totally different life.
Uh-huh.
And she felt as part of the master.
Okay, all right, go ahead.
Superior to the other slaves.
Mm-hmm.
And to be with them, you know, that's more like.
Yeah. But so what are we talking about? Now, why was the master able to do this, Kitty? Why was he able to come after 20 years of good treatment?
Because he owned her.
I beg pardon?
Because he owned her.
He what?
He owned her.
In other words, she was his what?
Slave.
Property. So what are we saying then? So the condition, the question of who was a good master, a good mistress, or a bad master, bad mistress, does it have any relevancy?
No.
Does it have any relevancy?
No.
Does it have any relevancy, Doreen?
No.
Why not?
Because you can do whatever you want at any time.
I beg pardon, will you repeat that, please?
The master can do anything he wants at any time.
At any time. What about the slave? Can she say, can Bianca say, well, listen, I've been living here for 20 years and have my way. I'm not going to go down in that house. Can you do that, Bianca?
Of course not.
Why not?
Really?
Huh?
Who am I? I'm just a slave. He could do with me whatever he feels like. Because he owns me.
Do you agree with that, Mark?
Yeah.
In other words, you can't fight it. If he says get down and go back into the slave quarters, you got to tuck your tail between your legs, figuratively, and go.
That's right.
And all because the master has the power of life and death over you. In other words, you are his property.
Absolutely.
And there is a principle in law, certainly in law of most countries, Anglo-Saxon law specifically, it says one can do whatever one wishes with one's property. Always with the proviso that what one does not infringe upon the rights of somebody else.
But a slave was not a somebody else.
Exactly. But I'm saying if he wanted, he couldn't take you and deliberately throw you down on the head of his neighbor Clemson Brown, who was another master.
Right.
Because that would be using you in such a way that would infringe upon his rights and his safety. Therefore, there's my point clear about this issue of good master, bad master, or which slavery was better and which slavery was worse. That is a specious argument that has no validity, has no relevance to the subject. The issue is slavery. And Aristotle makes this clear in his statement. When he says what? He's a slave. One man is owned, and his job is to do it just like we do with animals. So when you equate me with your chickens and your dogs, and even the cockroaches that you step on or not step on as you may wish to. So this then brings us to a situation where, when you look at this, and as he said, how the slaves felt, how the slaves themselves felt can only be judged by their actions, since they were not able to record their side of the case. It has, however, been well said that the slaves caused Rome to dwell for centuries on the lid of a slumbering volcano, meaning what? That even though Aristotle could say all he wanted about some men or people being designated as slaves naturally, these folks obviously at no time, and that's what we must keep our eyes on, Reverend Brown argued, that at no period did the slaves sit still for their chains, even though they were not able to write history, there's no time. Individual slaves, yes, at all times, just like you got individual people. There are people who, as long as you give them a crumb, they will allow you to kick their behinds from day the kingdom come. We have these kind of people. But that you don't go from the specific and make an evaluation based on the general. Because one slave says, I loves my master. Or as Malcolm X put it, what's the matter, master, is we sick. You see? You can't say, well, that's the way all slaves behave toward their master, because at the same time, since the master's class wrote most of the histories, the slave that walked in the master's room and tiptoed in and cut master's head off. You see, it is not in the interest of order. Well, I'm telling you this. It's not in the interest of order and the status quo to be writing about people like this, because other slaves or other exploited people might do what? Might get ideas. You see? I beg your pardon?
I said, so it's written as if they were not.
Precisely. And to excuse the horrors of the master class. It's just like in this society that there are part of people who tell you that anybody that wants a job in this country can get one. And if you're right, if you don't have a job, go lift yourself up by your bootstrap. It's your fault if you don't have a job. Lift yourself up by your bootstrap. If you was not lazy, and if you don't, then you say, but I ain't got no boot and I ain't got no strap. That's not my problem. Go raise some cows. Make you some leather. In other words, you take the position, and this is effective because it convinced most people who lose their jobs today feel guilty as though it's their fault. Because, yes.
It's the same with the homeless.
Precisely. You look at it on any level. The same with people on welfare. It's all their fault. And therefore the victim now starts saying, well, I must have done something wrong because how come I ain't got no job? Because what they do, they inculcate in all people of whatever class the idea that individuals own jobs. Think about that. You don't own no job. You might own that pen. You may own that cup of coffee. But you don't own no job. By definition, a job is something that somebody else has and you make an agreement to work with. And when the job is no longer there, for whatever reason, the man tells you, this is your last day. And we even have a term for that in this culture. It's called a pink slip. Yeah. Don't even put nothing. You can have people get a heart attack just by accidentally putting a little piece of pink paper in an envelope. I'm not kidding you, because the person, before he opens the envelope, he or she opens the envelope, they see that pink shining through, and somebody gets scared, hold up the light. Let me see if I can read it without opening it. Right? Oh my God. And then forgetting what the heck then the first thing you want to know, well, God, what did I do wrong? What did I do wrong? And that's why we have to begin to try to look this up. So what I'm saying is, when we look at these things, we must always understand that all the evidence is not in. I'm not finished yet. All right. Now, let's take it to the next step. You see, part of because I want to tie in, and I'm going across, but tying it in, because I want to make certain points while it's here. This kind of thinking, the good master, bad master, the happy slave, which is the concomitant of that, and and of course the happy slave is a slave who as the Calvinist says, servant, obey your masters. Remember that word, servant, servile, slave, obey your master, because obedience to your master is what? Obedience to who? God. Thank you. And by obeying your master, you therefore ensure that when you die, you will be, not only you'll be saved, but when you get to heaven, you will get your reward. But you ain't gonna get no reward here. Your reward here is to serve your master as best you can. Don't argue, don't run away, do what you have to do, and God will look upon you and look upon you favorably for this. And when you die, you will get your reward in heaven. Now the question of how about getting a little something here, like a little freedom, don't ask that, because that means you're not being true to God, because now you're giving your master problems. And this is not something, I'm putting it in my attempted humorous way, but this has been and was the status quo. Now, that then, when you look at certain projects, then you have to look at what is considered the relationship with the slaves that's in the other groups. A part of that, and a spin-off of that, is how it has been perceived about the relationship of black slaves here to certain of the European groups. The conventional wisdom, of course, is when we sit down in this city today, other places, and we talk about fighting for civil rights, the question always comes up, if we say that Jews exploit blacks, you then say, well, this is anti-Semitism, and you're being ungrateful. Even if it ain't anti-Semitism, you're being ungrateful because Jews have always been in the forefront of fighting for black rights. And a lot of us believe this. And there have been individual Jews, like individual other people, who've done this. But that does not make a case. Once again, you try to go from the specific to the general. And you say, well, of course not, because I'm always the good guys. And then I go out and I pick up this book written by two Jewish scholars. You know, I try to put it in y'all hand, but y'all don't know the good stuff. Jews in the South. Edited by Leonard Dennerstein and Mary Dale Paulson. Brother Hampton was smart enough, he jumped on a copy this last week like it's on see, right? You see him smiling over there, right? And here's what these scholars have to say. Got a whole thing on your Jews in South Carolina, for your fellow Jewish people there, right? Jewish life in the antebellum and Confederate South. But what I'd like to point out something to you is this section here. You see about the stereotypes, it's dangerous. This is a title, chapter called Jews and Negro Slavery in the Old South, 1789 to 1865. Now you could make the same argument for other groups, but other groups don't claim a special relationship with us, you see, right? As we inaugurate this 5-year-long observance of the Civil War, Introduction. Jews and Negro Slavery in the Old South, 1789 to 1865, and this is written by a gentleman called Bertram Wallace Corrin, K-O-R-N. As we inaugurate this 5-year-long observance of the Civil War, and this was an address delivered at the 59th annual meeting of the American Jewish Historical Society at the Jewish Museum of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in New York City, and was delivered on February 18, 1961 by one, as I aforesaid, Bertram, B-E-R-T-R-A-M, Wallace, W-A-L-L-A-C-E, Corrin, K-O-R-N. And I reiterate, as we inaugurate this 5-year-long observance of the Civil War, there's certain to be no diminution of the quantity of historical volumes already flooding forth from the nation's presses. One of the major subjects which will undoubtedly continue to be the questions of the questions of the causes of the Civil War. Some writers will favor political interpretations. Others will emphasize economic factors. Still others will cite social ingredients. Some will blame the North and others the South. Some will denounce foolhardy leadership in the South or in the North, or both. Others will underline the failure of ordinary citizens in both sections to express their feelings and desires. Many of these writers will be so enamored of their theories that they will overlook the all-pervasive influence of the crucial problem, slavery. Political, economic, social, psychological, and other currents were present as contributory factors, but they were all related in one way or another to the persistence of the slave system. Had Negro slavery not been an integral aspect of life of the Old South, there would have been no conflict, no secession, no war. Obviously, there would have been no reason for it, because we would not have been there, right? Differences there might have been, but not violence and bloodshed. Slavery was the single indigestible element in the life of the American people which fostered disunion, strife, and carnage, just as the concomitant race problem has continued to an important degree to be a divisive force in American life to this day. Previous students of the American Jewish scene have appeared to be reluctant to investigate the question of Jewish participation in the slave system. I will repeat this. Previous students of the American Jewish scene have appeared to be reluctant to investigate the question of Jewish participation in the slave system. Works on local Jewish history in southern communities in particular have either glossed over or altogether ignored this basic aspect of the life and experiences of the Jews of the Old South. It is my purpose to attempt to survey the following themes: Jews as planters and as owners of slaves, the treatment of slaves by Jews, the emancipation of slaves by Jews, Jews as harsh taskmasters, business dealings of Jews with slaves and free Negroes, Jews as slave dealers, cases of miscegenation involving Jews and Negroes, and opinions of Jews about the slave system. So I figure that covers a pretty comprehensive thing here, huh?
Who's in
I don't know. 1. Jews as planters and as owners of slaves. Only a small number of Jews in the Old South were planters. Sociological and economic factors explain why so few Jews achieved this characteristic Southern status of ownership and occupation. History had ordained that Eastern European Jews could not own land. Is that clear?
Inquisition.
Mm-hmm. The selection of occupations in which Jews could train their sons was severely delimited. Most Jews, out of natural inclination and the presence of circumstances, felt safer in urban areas where they could share each other's fellowship and find support in each other's presence. That also sounds familiar to me. If Jews desired to be loyal to their ancestral faith, they could fulfill this need only where other Jews resided, not in the rural areas. An additional pressure was the poverty which accompanied most immigrant Jews when they came to America. The average Southern Jew was, therefore, a peddler or storekeeper, out of which came riches, marcus, gimbals, etc., etc. With comparatively slim resources, who tended to live in a town or city and would not even think of aspiring to the ownership of a plantation. Some Jews found their way to the highest rung of the economic and social ladder through prosperous careers as merchants or professional men. Among this small number of men, probably the best known was Judah P. Benjamin, the brilliant New Orleans attorney who purchased an extensive plantation 20 miles below the city in 1844 in partnership with Theodore Packwood, who served as the resident manager. Not content with the rather smallish mansion house, Benjamin rebuilt Belle Chase into a magnificent house which finally fell victim to a housing development in 1960. Benjamin's home, in which he installed his sisters after his wife and daughter moved to Paris, was an elegant example of antebellum grace with, quote, great double-level porches almost 15 feet across, a parade of massive rectangular pillars and everything else in proportion, curving stairways of mahogany, going with the wind. Massive carved decorations, silver-plated doorknobs, extensive rose gardens between the house and the levee, and an enormous bell into which Benjamin was said to have dropped 500 silver dollars during the melting to sweeten the tone. Though Benjamin continued to practice his legal profession, he devoted great interest to his plantation, unlike the typical absentee landlord, and wrote articles and delivered speeches on the problem of sugar planting. Belle Chasse was staffed with 140 slaves, of whom about 80 were field hands. Benjamin sold the plantation after his election to the Senate. Another well-known Jewish planter was Major Raphael J. Moses, who owned land at Esquilin Hill near Columbus, Georgia. Moses, who became chief commissary officer of General Longstreet's Corps during the war, that is the Confederate Army, mind you, wrote in his memoirs that, quote, when the war broke out, I had 47 slaves, and when it ended, I had 47 freedmen. All left me except one, old London, who stayed with me until he died. So you see, we can't go from the specific to the general, right? Old London says, I was going to stay with you, master. What happened to another 47, Patrick? Gone in the wind. And I'm sure that Benjamin considered himself a good master. Other Jewish planters were Nathan Nathans, who was the president of Beth Elohim congregation of Charleston, South Carolina. Mordecai Cohn, who had 27 slaves on his plantation at St. Andrews, South Carolina, and his two sons, Marks and David, both of whom owned nearby farms. Isaac Lyons of Columbia, South Carolina, Bonnet Cohn of Kings Creek, South Carolina, and Chapman Levy, who turned from the law to planting when he moved to the Mississippi Territory. Various members of the Mordecai family had plantations in North Carolina and Virginia. Among other large plantation holdings, Moses Levy owned a magnificent home, Parthenope, on a plantation at the juncture of the Matanzas River and Moses Creek in Florida, which he sold to Achilles Murat, the French refugee. One of the few lady planters was Abigail Minus, who had a small plantation near Savannah on which she employed 17 slaves. The only Louisiana planter other than Benjamin whom we have been able to discover was J. Levy of Ascension Parish with 41 slaves working his field. There were probably a number of other Jewish owners of plantations, but altogether they constituted only a tiny proportion of the Southerners whose habits, opinions, and status were to become decisive for the entire section, and eventually for the entire country. In contradistinction, and it is astonishing to discover that there were several Jews who tried their hands as a plantation overseer, if only for a brief time. And one of them was a gentleman by the name of Solomon Pollock, a member of a well-known Philadelphia family who worked on a plantation near Mobile in the late 1830s. And then we look at the gentleman who was the first senator from my home state, Florida. There's a section on Judah P. Benjamin, but this man was called, and it's interesting how these people, they, in spite of all this thing about freedom, like them folks out in Minnesota who said, don't take my picture, right? All right. This gentleman's name is, but his name didn't start out as Yuli. Levy. All right, so let me just take a look at it. This is the way how people get lost, right? Obviously, if this country was so free of racism and anti-Semitism, why would anybody change your name? Huh? Or why would you say, don't point that camera at me? Leon Hubner, David L. Yulee, Florida's first senator. In other words, when Florida was made a state, Yulee was the first senator that went to the Senate, and there's a town in Florida not far about 20 miles outside of Jacksonville in Nassau County that is named for him, Yulee, Florida. And it's ironic that this is the Florida to this day that has no black residents and wouldn't even sell you a tank of gas within the town. They tell you very quickly, don't even stop here. This is one of those towns of which, like in folklore, where it says white folks read and run, niggers read and haul ass. Or the way it went, white folks read and walk fast, niggers read and haul ass. And I've seen sign that says, nigger, quote, don't let the sun go down on you here. I'm not talking about Nazi Germany. I'm talking about Florida, place where I was born in other times. But, well, last time I was through Yulee was 5 years ago.
Still there.
And it's still there. And it's still, well, it's grown a little. It's right at the crossroads of where US 101, the Buccaneer Trail, crossed US 17. And you go down Fernandina Beach, St. Augustine, right on the coastline. And Yulee sits at that, right at that crossroad. And to this day, it is still a town that if you see black folks there, they're passing through. And it's known by people for miles around. Nobody black even gets stops in Yulee after dark. Today. Today. There are lots of pockets of this all over this country. West Texas, for example, notorious for this. Though by no means, it is a curious fact that so little has been written concerning the careers of several Southern statesmen who were important figures in our national history during the period immediately preceding the Civil War. Men like Judah P. Benjamin. Though by no means as prominent as Benjamin, David L. Yulee was nevertheless a noteworthy figure in his day. It is therefore remarkable that beyond a dozen lines or so, nothing has ever been written concerning his career, with the exception of an article by his son, C. Wycliffe, W-I-C-K-L-I-F-F-E, Yulee, which, however, that's the son's article, is mainly of a reminiscent and personal character. In preparing this paper, therefore, it was necessary to go through original documents on file in various government departments, the public reports of Senate House and House committees, and the writings of distinguished contemporaries. Not only had Senator Yulee the distinction of having been a prominent factor in national affairs for over 20 years, but to him belonged in large measure the honor of having obtained the admission of Florida to the Union and of being her first senator. Beside this, he is of additional interest because he was the first Jew ever elected to the United States Senate. The father of David Levy never bore the name Yulee, Dave Yulee. The family name was Levy. And as David Levy, the future senator, first distinguished himself in the affairs of Florida. His father, Moses Elias Levy, was a native of all places, Morocco. Born at Mogador by 1782. Migrated to the island of St. Thomas, the Virgin Islands, in 1800 at the age of 18, and there engaged in the lumber and slave trading business, accumulating a considerable fortune. In 1816, he removed to Havana, Cuba, where he was a government contractor in supplying troops. 2 years later, he paid his first visit to the United States. The real history is really something else, ain't it, children? C. Wycliffe Yulee, in the sketch above referred to, claims a rather fanciful ancestry for his family. To quote from his article, quote, the senator's grandfather was a Portuguese who, quote, became a high official in the Emperor of Morocco's court, and as such had been given the rank of prince. That's according to the son Wycliffe's version, right? Upon the death of the emperor whose side he had espoused against the intriguing heir, he was obliged to fly at a moment's notice to England, taking with him his wife, an English Jewish, and their infant son, close quote. This child was Moses Levi. He was educated in an English university, but became a tradesman. And his mother, quote, who had exaggerated ideas as to the importance of the princely title, insisted upon his dropping of the name Yulee temporarily. You see how it is when you don't want to deal with, see, black folks ain't the only folks that try to pretend that certain things taste like sugar. And adopting the name of Levy, her own maiden name. This name he retained to the day of his death, although he approved of the resumption of family name by the senator. Now this is the son's Wycliffe version. And then the author says, in connection with the above statement, it must be borne in mind that Senator Yulee married out of his faith, and that his children were brought up as Christians. In fact, the article referred to shows a desire to escape the recognition of a Jewish ancestry as much as possible. So now who was practicing anti-Semitism? Why would he want to escape knowing who he was, huh? And aside from the fanciful statement as to how the name Levi came into the family, it even claims that the princely grandfather was not a Jew at all, but a Mohammedan by the name of Yulee. Now that means old C. Wycliffe was stretching a long way to get away from this, right? Naturally, he, of course, Wycliffe then was all Episcopalians. The fact remains, however, that the senator's father was never known by any other name but Moses E. Levy, and was always devoted to the ancient faith, meaning he remained a Hebrew. When he visited the United States in about 1818, he became enthusiastic over our free institutions. How about that? Free institutions, 1818. Get it, y'all? Free institutions, 1818? Free? And he completed settling here, but his affairs at the time did not permit him to remove. Even before Spain had ceded Florida to the United States, he had decided to settle in the eastern portion of that territory, and in August of 1820, through his agents Hernandez and Chevatian, he purchased about 45,000 acres of land, for which it appears he paid about $40,000. His plan was to bring families from Europe to settle on his plantation, and in 1820 he instructed his agent in London that the colonists designed for his settlement might be sent on. On June 8, 1821, he appeared in Philadelphia before the United States Court of Appeal and there declared his intention of becoming a citizen of the United States. About this time, he also visited New York and became acquainted with prominent Jews there, among other Daniel M. Fixato. Leaving Philadelphia, he went to St. Augustine, Florida by way of Charleston, and arrived there about the time of the change of sovereignty, that is from Spain to the United States. He purchased Negroes
It's all right. Go on. Keep going.
I was just pausing there. That's supposed to be dramatic emphasis. That's underlined. That's 3 exclamation marks. He purchased Negroes and commenced sugar planting at a place called Volusia. It is now Volusia County, Florida. About 8 miles above Lake George on the St. Johns River, and also at a place opposite this, which he named Hope Hill. And I would wonder, hope for who? Certainly not for them slaves. As early as 1822, he figured extensively in large land transactions in that portion of the territory. And then I'm going on down to where he says, Andrew Jackson became governor of the territory in March 1823, issued an ordinance which enabled those persons who were inhabitants of Florida at the time of the change of flag to become American citizens at once by complying with certain formalities. Under this ordinance, Levy renounced his allegiance to the King of Denmark, because they claim ownership then of, you know, the St. Thomas, the Virgin Islands, then, right? To whom St. Thomas belonged, and took the oath of allegiance to the United States, receiving a certificate of citizenship at St. Augustine. It was the method of obtaining his citizenship which subsequently proved to be a source of infinite trouble both to him and his son, which means that after David Yulee became very big in government politics and whatnot, a lot of the WAS and the Christians decided they really didn't want no Jew being in the Senate. So they challenged his seat in the Senate, or how you like that, on the ground that he was not really a bona fide citizen, because the way he had become. Hey, you got to get up early in the morning to beat these people out, stuff, right? Now, when Moses Levy visited the United States, he brought with him his son David. Like Alexander Hamilton, therefore, the future senator was born in the West Indies, the date of his birth being June 2nd, 1810. As the father desired to give his children the best possible education, he did not take them with him to Florida, but took the boy to Norfolk, Virginia, where he placed them with his intimate friend Moses Myers, then a leading Jewish citizen of Norfolk, who had held distinguished office and who at one time had represented the French Republic in the United States. David Levy attended school and continued to reside at Norfolk from 1819 to 1827, with the exception of occasional trips to the West Indies. In the meantime, his father had become one of the foremost citizens of St. Augustine. He had purchased extensive lands in the interior and was considered one of the most influential men in the territory. From the affidavit of Judge Elias B. Gould, printed in one of the government's publications, it appears that as early as 1822, Moses E. Levy took an active part in the politics of Florida, particularly on the subject of education and as a defender of the sacred institution. Anybody need 3 guesses of what sacred institution he was defending?
Slavery.
Slavery.
Nice name, sacred.
Yes. He even succeeded in 1824 in bringing about certain reforms in the administration of the law. And then we go and we look at Jacob, and this is very interesting. It's probably the only book I wasn't. So here we are. Now, that's just an introduction to tie in on that level. Who indeed are our friends? Now, I guess us. Now let us go back to look at what David Bryan Davis has to say. Remember, I led you all afield something that had nothing to do with us, way in the so-called Near East, Iraq, and all them places, right? Here we have part 1. How progress, quote, led to the Europeans' enslavement of Africans. That's the general title. And the opening, chapter 1. A black slave revolt in the Fertile Crescent. Now, the Fertile Crescent is where? The land between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And you might ask, what the hell was us doing there? And here's what he says. In the middle of the 9th century, that would be the 800s.
18.
No, the 9th century.
Yeah, right.
The 800s. In the middle of the night. Oh yes. Oh, let me. Some of y'all don't call me a liar. In other words, we're talking about 1,000 years ago. In the middle of the 9th century AD, 600 years before the Portuguese voyages initiated an oceanic slave trade from West Africa to the Iberian Peninsula. Did you understand what he said?
Yes.
A slave trade from where to where? From West Africa to where? Iberia. And where is Iberia? Spain and Portugal. Not an African slave trade to the West Indies, South America, or what is now the United States. All right? And if you want to know the year, I'll tell you the year. The year was 1443.
Before Columbus went to America, to West Indies, even before
Of
Spain.
course, that is correct. That is right. That 43 and 50 would be 93. As a matter of fact, 49 years before Columbus.
What year was the papal bull written giving the right?
The Assentio,
Yes.
the papal bull which gave the Assentio was written was given actually in about 1516.
That's when it became sacred.
That is correct. And we will tie and deal in terms with that. I hope that this meets with your approval, Minister Brown.
Oh, yes.
All right. Listen, hold it. Next week, what about the marriage?
I'm going to be here next week.
Well, you owe these people an announcement. Let's take a break before
yeah.
we go. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, hell. It's not oh, yeah. It's not an afterthought.
I'm getting married next week.
Oh, yeah.
Okay?
It's not slavery. Make
All
sure that it's not
Remember-
slavery.
And not only this, the dude went home. He got himself an Irish Colleen, a real one, yes. Yeah. All right, so we'll see you next week. You call me and let me know where to go, okay?
What county is you made from?
Dublin.
Dublin.
All right. All right. So you let me know, Matthias. All right, we'll have to take up one, so we'll take, sorry that we got to take up a collection for him, all right?
Yeah.
Okay, now, let's start over again. In the middle of the 9th century AD, 600 years before Portuguese voyages initiated an oceanic slave trade from West Africa to the Iberian Peninsula, 800 years before African slaves displaced white agricultural workers in Barbados and other British West Indian colonies, a full millennium before the issue of restricting or extending black slavery precipitated the American Civil War, many thousands of black slaves worked in regimented gangs on the tidal flats of southern Iraq.
Salt mines.
Sorry about that. Yes. I think I have made a rather dramatic connection.
Can you read it again?
Yeah.
You would like me to read
Yes,
it again?
please.
Yeah.
All right, let's go back because I don't want this to be left out. Once again, with apologies to your videotape. The title of chapter 1 is A Black Slave Revolt in the Fertile Crescent. That is the sector of Arabia where it's fertile in Iraq, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates. In the middle of the 9th century AD, 600 years before Portuguese voyages initiated an oceanic slave trade from West Africa to the Iberian Peninsula, 800 years before African slaves displaced white agricultural workers in Barbados and other West Indian colonies, a full millennium before the issue of restricting or extending black slavery precipitated the American Civil War, many thousands of black slaves worked in regimented gangs on the tidal flats of southern Iraq, spelled I-R-A-Q. Much of the Tigris-Euphrates Delta, interlaced with ancient dikes and canals, had become abandoned marshland overgrown with tall reeds that sheltered wild game as well as various kinds of rebels and outlaws. Now that brings us right back to what Mr. Coblin was saying was happening about 1,000 years before that, 137 AD. What has changed?
Nothing.
All right? As peasants had migrated to the thriving towns of the Abbasid Empire, here goes them wandering folks leaving the roadside again, right? They came out of the country of Rome and went into Rome, here, right? Same pattern, different time. As peasants had migrated to the thriving towns of the Abbasid Empire, that's A-B-B-A-S-I-D, rich farmland had been repeatedly flooded and encrusted with salt and other mineral sediment. Although the Abbasid Empire, which lasted from 1750 to 1258, long preceded the idea of progress as understood by early modern philosophers and historians Arab entrepreneurs knew that intensive labor could reclaim this wasteland, remove the mineral deposits, and prepare the subsoil for cultivation. What crops were to be cultivated is unclear, though rice, barley, millet, sorghum, onions, and melons were all grown in the region. And it is tempting to note that sugar, a luxury unknown to Europe before the Crusades of the 11th and 12th centuries, was already becoming an important export from Shustar in neighboring Kyrgyzstan. And that then was the homeland of the Kurds.
Thank you. The names are the same.
That's right. In any event, in Basra, the region's commercial, financial, and agricultural center, wealthy proprietors had received extensive grants of tidal lands on the condition that they make it arable. This task of land reclamation, is that the last slide? This task of land reclamation involving the extraction and removal of mountains of salty debris it makes it kind of funny. All right, let's start again. This task of land reclamation involving the extraction and removal of mountains of salty debris required a kind of labor force that may have been unique in early Islamic history. But the sources for that history are fragmentary and often consist of later compilations of oral traditions attuned to genealogical and religious disputes, not to the economic institutions that arose in the wake of Islam's lightning strokes of Eurasian and African conquest. Do you understand what he's saying? In other words, when they finally started getting information, they didn't attune it to the historical thing. They bent whatever happened to suit the religious and genealogical argument. Now, that brings us back to what happened on Wednesday night at the slaves, why you up and on, okay?
Yeah.
All right? But people, they need to know them things, okay? Now,
The name of this book is what again?
this is called Slavery and Human Progress, 1984. All right? Now,
Mackey,
huh?
did you say that book is out of print?
Yes, it is. But hey, and it's never the last 1984, but you might find you look for it. You know, if I see your order, right? There's never the last anything in New York.
Sorry.
That's all right. It gives me a chance to wet my whistle.
Off camera, too.
Our limited knowledge of slave labor in southern Iraq derives from the fortuitous event of a massive slave revolt that could not escape commentary. In other words, you couldn't escape Denmark Vesey. You couldn't ignore Nat Turner. You couldn't ignore Frederick Douglass. You couldn't ignore Marcus Garvey. You couldn't ignore King. Is that clear? In other words, it's too big to ignore, so you have to deal with it. Even though you only deal with it as limited thing as possible, but you must deal with it. You can't cover it up. Now, most of the slaves were Zanji. Zanj. And you think of Zanzibar in East Africa. Or blacks of East African origin. While some of these Zanjis and other black slaves had been transported across the Red Sea and by caravan across Arabia, it seems probable that for an indeterminate period, slave ships had followed the northeast monsoons from the coast of South Somalia to the Persian Gulf's inland port of Basra, which again is another city in Iraq, from which Sinbad sailed on his legendary adventures in the Spice Islands in East Africa. Most of the Zanj were apparently owned by absentee proprietors in Basra, who delegate authority to drivers and overseers of various kinds. What would y'all do without the old professor?
Stay ignorant.
or not be as smart as you were, right? These veritable capitalists, as Alexander Popovich termed them, were an anomaly in the Islamic world, which generally defines slavery as a domestic or military institution. But the evidence suggests that the Zon suffered from labor conditions as oppressive as those in the West Indies some 8 or 9 centuries later. As early as the late 7th century, slave insurrections, apparently involving many blacks, were quickly and ruthlessly crushed. Then, in September 869, the Zanjas rose in what was to become the greatest slave revolt from the Roman servile wars of the 2nd and 1st centuries BC to the Black Revolution of the 1790 that destroyed France's most lucrative colony, Saint Dominique, or which we know as Haiti. How much of it has been written about? How much have you seen about, other than what read here? Yes, Minister Brown.
If you could do one clarification.
Yes.
Because, and it becomes very clear. The Romans had slavery.
Yes.
Who were those slaves? And then after the Roman domination of that area,
Yeah.
because, you know, the Greeks...
But the Greeks, before the Romans, Greek, yes.
So what happened then? Islam comes in, slaves... You know, we need to...
Well, I'm going to run that down in part 2. We'll run it down, but just to give a briefy thing. As I said to you before, remember, we have to look at definitions. We don't need to look at it through contemporary eyes to understand it. If we can lift the veil, and I'll put this on the board so you can see it. Again, as far as those people, and we're not going back to the Carthaginians. Well, just talking, if you want to look at Greece or Rome, as they like to say a modern term. All right, to the Greeks, there were 2 kinds of people. Which would be Greeks
And barbarians.
and barbarians.
But the barbarians were still people.
What did I say here?
Put it in parentheses.
What did I do? What did I do to people?
Make it a different term.
Yes, it's a quote. So that's all right. Greeks and I'm not going to say and. Greeks vs. All right. To the Romans, Dio.
Ditto. Except they put Romans.
That's right. I just say Romans. What?
What I wanted to ask them a few minutes ago, an
Yeah.
hour ago, to point out, but for them they were still human beings. They were
Not necessarily. No, ma'am. Barbarians was just that. It was used as a dehumanizing term.
That's right.
In other words, you could do whatever you wanted to do to the barbarian. You follow what I'm saying?
Did they say 3/5 of a human being? Did
No,
they
no,
say that?
but you don't have to say 3/5 of a human being. Different times, different circumstances alter definitions. Different times develop. You follow what I'm saying? Again, it would be like saying, Sancho, which kind of slavery was worse or was better. If we look at, in other words, we remove the concept of skin color or hair texture. Now, remember, the Romans, mothers, used to scare their children, by using this phrase.
We got to do it.
At the gate. At what a gate, a port. A port is any opening, entrance, exit, right? Now, when the Roman mother said this about Hannibal, she was referring to him as what, mark this carefully, what the later southern people would use black folks and call them as
Boogeyman.
Now, what have they done to Hannibal and the Carthaginians? They are barbarians or foreigners. The term meant. So what have they said? When you say to a child, you don't mind me, Hannibal is going to get you, or the boogeyman is going to get you, what are you saying to that child?
Something evil.
Right. Something non-human, a dangerous, a demon, a Saddam Hussein, if you will. Huh? An Ayatollah or Khomeini. A Noriega, whoever. Right? An Ortega. A Paul Robeson.
Thank you.
Huh? A Sancho.
Anything you
Now,
want.
what that means, and we see this, and let's watch it. I'll go down to this because the day before I want to tie this part up if you got the time, and you'll see the connection. Because what we're looking at the foreign or the ancient developments, or the ancient beginnings, if you will, of the modern day malaise and the way in which societies, including the one we are, can instantly create non-people. And once you create the non-people with the assistance and support of the media, it don't take, at least the Greeks and the Romans, it took a little time. But with modern media techniques, right, Doreen, we do this instantly. You get Dan Rather over here and this one here, and somebody coming here and somebody standing up with a thing out there. And of course, is anybody giving the opposite, Gigi?
No.
No, so immediately, bam, you've got you instant creating barbarians. No questions. And the other point was, the other advantage, most of the people in ancient time could not read and write.
Thank you.
Today, if you're inside from the radio media, you got the print media, everybody, you can get the message out there, you can disseminate, the information or monsterize the barbarians whoever you want to. Now how we know this, how further stated, when you look at the laws, Sancho, of these people, and how the penalties for even the same crime. For a Roman, it would be one thing. For the barbarian outsider, something that a Roman might be slapped on the hand for, the barbarian get his head cut off for. And it was stated clearly, why was his head cut off? Because he or she is what? A barbarian. So the question of whether we see them as people, you follow what I'm saying? You could argue, at the very best, if they saw them as people, they saw them very much as the way in the later years in the months of South, the modern slave trade, that the masters saw Africans. As people who were not quite people, slavery was the best for them. Because what does Aristotle say here? Yeah? And I remember, now here's the other thing. Greek slavery was a slavery, when you talked about Athenian slavery, remember, we're not talking about political and national entities as we look at them today. Right, Gordon? No, we're talking about something in this time were a group of what? City-states. That meant all of those states that we see now, all of that what we now call Greece, Greece the country, in the days of Aristotle, that would, no such entity would be considered. One would have allegiance to a city. And of all the cities, Athens in Greece was the city. And Athens was constantly at war with other Greek city-states. Not, you follow what I'm saying? Huh?
Like Sparta.
Exactly, like Sparta. Or the Macedonians are not Greeks. They're related, as you know, more to you. But nevertheless, they were the people, and now, all of these people still occupied the Greek peninsula.
Were they enslaving other Greeks?
Yes, what am I saying?
Oh, so would you explain them?
Exactly.
If you were a prisoner
If you
of war,
raw,
you either die.
you follow what I'm saying? In other words, even though Athens was an independent entity unto itself, all those other city-states, Sparta, whatnot, were also independent, and they also occupied the same area and most spoke the same language, the various dialects of the same variation of the same language. All right? But yet, now remember, in all these city-states, we look at their record. It's not something we have to think about. They were constantly at war with these other city-states. Right? Now, one of these cities always won. Rarely did they have a standoff where you say, okay, let's pick up our marble and go home.
Except the siege of Troy.
All right. But again, the Trojans were Asians, so they were outside anyway, right? Ilium and present day. So, okay? So that meant then that whenever one of these cities lost,
They had some slaves.
you had some slaves. Now, who are these cities? You're not going to Iran, they're Greeks. So what do you do with the losers? You divide them up. All right, this one may be dangerous, boom, off go your head. Or whatever the method of execution was. Or you draw lots for his things.
Or you made them gladiators.
Or you made them gladiators to entertain the troops, train them. Or the other part became what the Romans later called servile. They lived as long as they were useful. And this was not people that looked like me or whatnot. These were people that you would consider, today would be considered Greeks.
So they were no different from the rest of African tribes in the south.
Precisely. Exactly.
Except for one point that you gotta keep remembering. Slaves were not born slaves.
That's the other thing. Now,
Slaves were the captured warriors or the captured women, but
and the other point of this was that there was no such thing as being born. If you're not born a slave, that meant that slavery, the slave condition, to the extent it existed, it ceased with your death.
Thank you.
Nobody had the idea that the slave class, so that meant that the slave class was an unstable class, wasn't it? Wasn't doing anything, right? Because you see what happened in the Western world, what they did when they created this new thing, or the new version of what? Chattel.
Slavery, that's property.
Chattel slavery, right? Chattel, which is property. Now, and that brings in a whole new kettle of smoke, and it brings in whole new laws. Because once you've got this, what do you have to do? You must redefine. Right?
Right.
You have to redefine your laws now around slavery. Because now, once you talk about a property, you're saying not only does my property right hold legally for the life of you, Brown the slave, but my property right extends into any children you have, and children's children. But then here came another problem. Very quickly, there became what they like call miscegenation, not intermarriage, at least intersex, between people of the master class, people of the slave class. And since the intersex is always used, as a rule, happen between the male of the master class and the female of the slave class, that ultimately started creating another problem. That is, who
Gets the property.
and who gets the property, and who gets the property, but who was property. So, and now who made the rules? Masters. Masters were mostly who? Men. We talked about the proprietary right that they had in women. Because women, remember, could not own property in their own right. Anything they had, their husband spoke for them. So therefore, it was the men that made the decision, the males that made the decision. So therefore, if I'm the male, and I'm the one who is having carnal knowledge of my female slaves, I own them. If I won't have, no, I have to, I'm the one who's having carnal knowledge. I then have to modify the rules again, don't I? Because say, well, hey, if I'm making all of these children, it is always a risky business. To make assumptions is very, very dangerous. Simon Bolivar, Giuseppe Garibaldi, Fidel Castro, classic of modern example, that came from Cuban aristocracy, descended Spanish Castilian blood, not even mestizo.